Welcome to a place where love isn't surface deep, it's slow, forbidden, breathtaking, and unforgettable. This isn't just romance. These are stories of quiet longing, of women who thought their hearts had closed forever, until a gaze, a voice, or a moment cracked them wide open. Here, age isn't a barrier. It's the reason the love is deeper. These stories follow women who buried their desire, who stopped believing in being seen, until he walked in, older, wiser, quieter now, but he remembered her. And more than that, he saw her. What starts as memory becomes magnetism. What starts as a line drawn in the sand becomes the surrender neither of them expected. If you've ever believed love can arrive late but hit deeper than ever before, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, because the stories we tell here don't fade. They awaken, and once they start, they never let go. He was once just a boy with curious eyes, bright, eager, always full of questions. I still remember the way he used to linger after class, not to ask anything important, but just to stay a little longer. He'd pretend to be gathering his books slowly, glancing up with a smile that barely reached his cheeks, still untouched by life's real weight. Back then, he was all potential, all unspoken energy, bottled up in a boy not yet old enough to understand the effect he would one day have on the world, or on me. I never thought anything of it. How could I? There were rules, there were expectations. I was a guide, a figure in his life meant to shape ideas, not hearts. But life has a way of folding back in on itself, showing you the same soul through a different lens. And when he returned years later, that lens had shifted so completely. It shook something inside me I didn't know was still awake. He walked into the coffee shop like someone I should have recognized, but couldn't place at first. Taller now, his shoulders filled out, his jaw defined. But it wasn't just the way he carried himself. It was the way he looked at me. That same curiosity was still there, but it wasn't innocent anymore. It was direct, intentional, a look that lingered but not out of immaturity, out of desire, a look that said, "I see you," and somehow I let myself be seen. We spoke like two people catching up on the surface. Small laughs, talk of where life had taken us. But beneath every exchange, there was this unspoken pull, not rushed, not desperate, just alive. I found myself smiling at things that weren't even funny. I found myself wondering how long it would be before we spoke again. The shift wasn't sudden. It never is, not when it's real. It crept in gently, through short messages, random meetups, shared silences that somehow felt louder than the words we said. I told myself it was harmless. He was just someone I used to know, someone I'd helped shape, but slowly the lines began to blur, and not in a way that made me feel guilty, just in a way that made me feel real. I started to see the man in him, not the student, not the boy, the man, the way he listened, not just to respond, but to truly hear, the way he looked at me, not like a woman who had passed her peak, but like someone he'd been searching for. It was unsettling at first, beautiful but terrifying. I'd spent so long keeping those doors locked, telling myself that love, real love, passionate, deep, soul-waking love, was something that belonged to another version of me. A younger, freer version, but he reached in quietly and found the key. He never pushed, he never rushed, he just stayed, gently consistent, patiently steady, and I began to unravel, not in pieces, but in layers. Layers I didn't realize were still so tightly wound. I found myself wanting to be near him, wanting to hear his thoughts, wanting to understand how someone who once looked up to me could now make me feel so grounded, so wanted, so whole. I watched him once, across a room, talking to someone else, laughing, confident, and for a moment I forgot the years that separated us. I forgot the titles and roles. I just saw a man, strong, certain, with a warmth in his smile that could melt the most frozen of hearts. Mine, apparently, and yet, even with all that, I tried to resist it. not because it didn't feel right, but because it felt too right, because once you let something that real in, you can't pretend anymore. You can't go back to silence or half-hearted connections or going through the motions. He was too vivid, too present, too deeply etched into the parts of me that had long stopped hoping to be touched. There were moments I'd lie awake, thinking of the rules I was breaking, not in society, but within myself, the beliefs I'd carried for years, the belief that love after a certain age had to be safe, quiet. That longing was for the young. That passion was something you traded in for stability, for routine, for being sensible. But he made me feel reckless again, in the best way, not careless, but brave. There was one night, quiet, late, the city asleep around us. We were just walking, no destination, just the sound of our footsteps and the closeness of our arms brushing now and then. He stopped, looked at me, and said, "You don't have to be anything else when you're with me." And something inside me collapsed. Not in weakness, in relief. He saw past the years, past the history, past the identity I'd built so carefully. He saw the woman, the one who still wanted to be kissed slowly, held tightly, spoken to like she mattered beyond her wisdom or her years. Desired, not out of nostalgia or fantasy, but because of who she was in that very moment. I let him kiss me that night, and it wasn't wild, it wasn't desperate, it was reverent. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't ask for permission, because it already knows the answer. The kind that feels like a promise. Everything changed after that, not in loud, chaotic ways, but in quiet, undeniable shifts. Every touch, every word, every shared glance carried weight, history, trust, and a kind of intimacy that can't be taught or explained, only lived. And as strange as it sounds, I don't regret a single thing, because sometimes love doesn't come wrapped in the package you expected. Sometimes it walks back into your life with broader shoulders and a deeper voice and eyes that still hold that same spark, but now they carry intention, not just curiosity. And when you look back, when you truly see what's unfolded, you realize that what you thought was once a chapter closed was actually just the beginning. She didn't plan to feel again, not like that, not in the quiet, trembling way that sneaks up on you and catches your breath mid-sentence. For so long, life had become about duties, routines, keeping things running. Her heart, once full of dreams and fire, had grown tired, not broken, just dimmed, the kind of stillness that comes not from pain, but from years of putting everyone else first. She never mourned love. She simply set it down one day and never picked it back up. It had been years since anyone had looked at her with true attention, not polite conversation, not professional courtesy, real soul, deep attention. And yet, somehow, without warning, there he was, standing in front of her again, grown, different, but familiar in a way that reached places inside her she thought she'd closed for good. She wasn't prepared for the sound of his voice now. Deeper, more settled, more certain. There was warmth in it, not the uncertain, excitable tone of youth, but something calmer, steady, unshaken. She remembered the boy who used to light up when he had a thought, a question, a moment of connection. But now his laughter carried something else. It carried gravity, and somehow it reached into her and stirred pieces of her she hadn't felt move in a long time. She didn't go looking for him. Life brought him back. A chance meeting, a shared space, an overlap of paths that once ran parallel, but now crossed again in the most unexpected way. And at first, she was cautious, distant even, not out of coldness, but out of habit. It was easier to stay in the quiet, easier to avoid the risk of hope, but he didn't ask her to open up. He just kept showing up. Sometimes he'd ask her things, small things, thoughtful things, questions most people never thought to ask. What do you miss the most about who you used to be? What makes you feel calm? When's the last time someone made you feel truly wanted? And at first, she brushed them off with vague answers, soft smiles, gentle deflections. But deep down, she felt something trembling under the surface. He didn't treat her like a memory. He didn't treat her like a woman defined by her age or her past. He treated her like someone worth discovering all over again. And when he looked at her, it wasn't with admiration for who she had once been. It was desire for who she was now. She tried to ignore the feelings, she really did. There were moments where she would tell herself it was just a tension, just a phase, just a flattering echo of the past. But then he'd do something simple, hold her gaze a second longer than necessary, laugh in a way that made her stomach flutter, offer her his jacket when the wind picked up, not out of politeness, but because he noticed her shiver before she even said a word. One evening, they sat on a park bench, the world moving slowly around them. They had been talking about books, nothing heavy, just shared ideas. And then there was a pause. He looked at her, quiet, thoughtful. And in that silence, she felt it, not lust, not fantasy, longing, real breath, stealing longing. She didn't speak, she couldn't, because something inside her cracked open in that moment. A small, invisible fracture that let something warm seep in. Something she didn't know she was missing. The days that followed felt different. Every glance, every smile, every shared moment carried weight, and she found herself drawn to him, not in a way that sought validation, but in a way that reminded her of who she still was beneath all the layers. Not the caretaker, not the professional, not the woman who had lived on autopilot for years, but the woman who still wanted to feel, still wanted to be seen, still wanted to be chosen, and that's what he did. He chose her, not loudly, not with grand declarations, but in the quiet ways that matter most, the way he remembered her favorite scent, the way he reached for her hand without hesitation, the way he leaned in just close enough to make her heart race, but never too far, never rushed. She didn't expect the first touch to undo her the way it did. It was subtle, a hand on her waist as they passed each other in the kitchen, fingers grazing hers as he handed her a glass of wine. But those touches lingered, not just on her skin, but in her soul. They reminded her she still had edges, still had heat, still had depth worth exploring. She didn't plan to feel again, but he broke the silence inside her, and once that silence was broken, there was no going back. It wasn't lust that stirred inside her when he entered a room. It was something quieter, more dangerous, something that slipped under the skin and stayed there long after he'd gone. It wasn't the way he looked at her, though there was a warmth in his gaze that lingered like heat on her cheek. It was the way he listened, the way he stood still while she spoke, not waiting to reply, not filling the silence, just being there, fully there, present in a way no one had been in years. For so long, she had learned to be careful with her words, to measure her emotions, to carry herself with grace and restraint because the world didn't allow women like her to fall apart, let alone be vulnerable. She had built her life on self-control, on quiet strength. But around him, something uncoiled. He didn't ask for more than she was ready to give. He didn't take or demand. He simply stayed, through silences, through awkward pauses, through the soft tremors of old fears rising in her chest when she felt herself begin to feel again. He made no grand moves, no sweeping declarations. He just stayed, and somehow that made everything inside her softer. There were moments she caught herself reaching for him without realizing it. A glance, a question, a laugh that felt too easy. She would scold herself in quiet, remind herself of boundaries, of the difference in their lives, their years, the rules she had lived by. But rules crumble in the presence of real connection, and his presence wasn't a temptation. It was a comfort, the kind of comfort that reaches into the parts of you that no longer believe in being known. He gave her that space, that grace, to not be perfect, to not be composed, to not always know the answers. And that was more intimate than any kiss could have been. There were nights they sat on her porch with nothing but the sound of crickets between them. She would talk sometimes about her garden or the way the seasons changed. He would listen, his eyes soft, never needing to fix anything, never interrupting the flow. She could feel the weight of his attention, steady and warm. She hadn't felt that kind of safety in a long time. Not the safety of being protected, but the safety of being accepted. One evening it was raining, a soft, misty rain that wrapped the world in hush. They stood near the kitchen window, and she turned to hand him a towel. Their fingers brushed, and still he didn't move, he didn't lean in, he just looked at her, looked into her, and something inside her slipped. The desire wasn't urgent. It didn't roar, it whispered. A slow ache. A longing not for skin, but for soul. She began to see him not just as the boy he had once been, or the man he had become, but as something that mirrored her, a reflection of all the things she had buried and now dared to feel again. She would lie awake some nights, feeling the echoes of his nearness. Her chest would tighten with guilt and wonder. Could this be real? Could this be right? But the questions always fell quiet beneath the memory of his presence. How he made her feel human again. Not wanted for what she used to be, but cherished for who she was now. The night of their first kiss wasn't marked by candles or dramatic confessions. It came after laughter, after stories, after silence. He stood in the doorway, hesitant to leave. She had walked him out like always, but lingered a little too long. And then, without a word, he stepped closer. He didn't touch her face. He didn't grab her waist. He just stood there, close enough that she could feel his breath, but far enough that she could walk away if she needed to. He gave her that choice, that freedom, and that was the moment she fell. She reached for him, she who had always held back, she who had learned to stay guarded, she who told herself she would never cross that line. She reached for him, and their lips met not in hunger, but in trembling stillness. Like a question being asked through touch, like surrender not to him but to the truth they had both been circling for weeks, that this, whatever it was, had grown quietly, tenderly, beneath every word they'd spoken and every silence they'd shared. Her hands shook, so did his, but neither pulled away, and in that kiss she didn't feel shame. She didn't feel fear. She felt home. It didn't happen all at once. It was never about crossing a line or chasing something forbidden. It was slower than that, quieter. It came in glances held a little too long, in conversations that lingered past the point of casual, in the way he looked at her like he saw more than what others had always chosen to overlook. She had spent years living inside boundaries, some imposed by the world, some by herself, and for the most part, she was at peace with them. She knew her place. She had accepted that certain chapters were closed, that certain types of love were no longer meant for her. But then he came back. He was no longer the boy she once knew. Time had reshaped him, hardened some of his edges, deepened his voice, settled something strong and steady behind his eyes. But it wasn't just the way he looked. It was the way he saw her, not as a memory, not as a role, but as a woman, a whole one, that unsettled her more than she liked to admit, because it woke up parts of her she thought had fallen asleep forever. She tried to push the feelings down. She tried to stay in control. It felt irresponsible, dangerous even, but there was no calculation to what was growing between them, no plan, just moments that carried too much meaning, that felt too honest to ignore. She would find herself holding her breath when he spoke, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, with a softness that made her feel like he was talking to the part of her that had been waiting to be heard. She laughed differently with him, slower, freer. Her body, even in stillness, responded to his presence, not with lust, with recognition. She remembered one night. She was sitting at the edge of her bed, still fully dressed, replaying the way his eyes had lingered on hers before he left. There was nothing improper about it, nothing overt, and yet her heart had skipped in that old, reckless way she thought was long gone. The world would never understand. People would twist it, shame it, reduce it to something it wasn't. They'd say it was wrong, inappropriate. They'd call her foolish, call him naive, but they didn't see the truth. They didn't see what existed in the space between his stillness and her silence. They didn't feel what she felt when he stood close enough for her to hear the steadiness of his breath. She told herself it couldn't happen. She reminded herself of everything that separated them, the years, the history, the expectations, but nothing about this felt planned or chosen. It felt inevitable when he touched her for the first time, not with hunger, but with reverence. Her whole body stilled. It wasn't about claiming. It was about asking. It was about wondering if she would let herself be loved again. And she did, not all at once, not easily, but fully, because what they shared was never rooted in rebellion. It didn't bloom out of desperation or fantasy. It bloomed from truth, from the honesty of two hearts that finally found the courage to stop pretending. He gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't tasted in years. He didn't want her to change. He didn't chase after youth. He wanted her as she was, in the fullness of her age, her mind, her fears. He loved her not despite her scars, but because of them. That was the difference. That was the shift. What began in shadows slowly made its way into light. They didn't rush. They didn't explain. They just kept showing up for each other, in little ways, in quiet hours, in the soft undoing of a woman who had long forgotten what it felt like to be touched without expectation. She still remembers the first time they woke up next to each other, not in chaos, not in guilt, but in quiet peace. He held her like he was anchoring himself, and she rested against him like she finally belonged somewhere safe. There were no words needed, no explanations offered, just warmth, breath, skin. The sacredness of it all never left her, because what they had was never about scandal. It was about timing, about two souls who had to grow separately in order to find each other whole. The world could whisper all it wanted. She had heard louder things, her own doubts, her own fears, and yet here she was, choosing love that made her feel more alive than she had in decades, not because it was thrilling, but because it was real, and real love, when it finally comes, doesn't ask for permission. It just happens quietly, powerfully, irrevocably, and once it does, you know, without a doubt, you'll never settle for anything less again. Thank you for listening to a story that wasn't just about love, but about rediscovery, quiet longing, and the kind of connection that defies time. If it touched something in you, it's because this love wasn't rushed. It waited, it grew, and when it arrived, it didn't ask questions. It just held on. If you're drawn to stories that stir your soul, whisper truth, and make you believe again in the power of being seen, don't just leave. Stay with us, like, comment, and subscribe for more love that burns slow, feels deep, and never lets go.